Okay, that sounds good. So as I said, the brain is trying to resist change in predictable ways. That is probably one of the key cornerstones why behavioral science is important in organizational change management. Because if we look at the evolution of the brain, we seek safety, we seek to avoid uncertainty, and we seek to stick with what we know because it carries little risk. And from an evolutionary perspective, that makes tons of sense, right? The human brain is engineered in such a way that it's coded to survive, reproduce, procreate, all these basic human strategies, and they don't match too well with rapid change and uncertainty. And of course, back in the day, this was a great strategy for survival. But now that we are in an environment that is changing so rapidly, often characterized by volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity even, um, being able to cope with change and to be agile is actually quite important. So we want to change the way that our brains are looking at change. And to do that, we'll dive a little bit deeper into some of the examples. Because what we've seen on the work floor is that when you bring this idea of the brain resisting change, and it's not just, it's not just the brain mechanism, it's also context, it's also behaviors. We see a lot of examples. The best change managers that we've worked with told us that even them, with tons of years of experience, still often, underscope resource and capital requirements when they're planning for a big change. It's always hard to guess how much time is needed, how many resources are needed. And oftentimes they also tell us that they told us that they noticed that their company sometimes doubles down on projects that they know are not going ideally smooth or are not having the returns that they wanted, but they're still doing it. And we behavioral scientists, we are looking at what is behind this. And then we come to these logical fallacies and cognitive biases that these are terms that you might have heard before, these shortcuts of our brain that explain why we are acting under conditions of change in such a way. So, for example, there's the planning fallacy and the sunk cost fallacy, which explain, or at least partly explain, what we just went through, why we underscope capital requirements, why we underscope planning, why we double down on failing projects. Another interesting phenomenon that we've spotted is that in every organization, sometimes small risks are seen as zero risks. So we have this big project going on, and there's a small risk that it might completely go off rails. But this will not happen to us because it never happened before, and yet we're careful people. But here again, there is a bias or a logical fallacy that might be present in the mind of the decision maker. This is what we call the zero risk bias. And of course, we can talk about lists of biases and barriers for behavior for many hours. We're not going to do that. We're going to dive into some of the practicalities as well. But to just give you some more examples, we don't just see this with change professionals. We see this with the employees as well. We're trying to change behavior in a positive way in large organizations, but we see that even though we're doing our best, we're having purposeful efforts, there is resistance. This is what we call the reactance bias. People don't want to be told what to do. They like change, but oftentimes they don't like to change. They want to maintain autonomy. They want to maintain responsibility and ownership. And often you see these biases occurring. People stick to what's familiar to them. This is called the status quo effect. And oftentimes, and this is probably one of the more painful ones, when you're working on a big change project and you're building new behaviors and you're installing new ways of working, sometimes we see that employees are reverting back to old practices. And not just employees, even management and board level stakeholders can do this too. This is often described as the regression bias. So basically what the point that I'm trying to make is that while we have the best intentions and the best, logical and rational strategies for change and trying to change the way we work and change the way our organizations work, oftentimes we still don't achieve the results that we want because of these barriers, both in our minds, in the context that we live in the organizational culture. And that is what we're trying to bridge. We're trying to build techniques and interventions that take this into account and that help you change behavior in a lasting and effective way. So let's take that to another level and bridge that gap between the behavioral barriers and biases and actual solutions. The problem with these biases and behavioral barriers is that, you've probably heard of the word cognitive bias and conscious bias many times. And it's already giving it away. These biases are often unconscious. We're often not completely aware of their occurrence. We're often not completely aware that our own reasoning is biased. And because of this, we only see it when it's too late already, when the outcomes present suboptimal results. Then, biases here also, they're not very observable or measurable. And they often, that's probably the biggest risk with our shortcuts, biases, heuristics, our own psychology, is that it's being amplified by organizational factors. So the company culture, the ways of working, the way in which policies and processes are enacted. And this whole complex puzzle, and of course, this goes way beyond just individual biases or individual barriers. It's a large and complex system, but we see that without knowledge of the brain, it is quite hard to navigate. Knowing how the human mind works and how it enacts in professional contexts can be very helpful when you're designing interventions and strategies for change. So how do we deal with all this stuff? We tried multiple approaches at Neurofied with the team, working with different types of context, and usually trying to change the way that people think, trying to de-bias people, teach them completely novel ways to approach problems. Taking the bias out of them is really hard. But what you can do is you can take people and organizations and teams out of the bias. And what I mean with that is you can create processes, you can create systems, you can create cultures and environments that prompt people to make decisions that are in line with the changes that we want, that prompt people to behave in such a way that is positively aligned with change, that is bringing them step by step further to the changes that we seek. So basically, creating that context that allows for change is the way forward. Now, how do you do this? Of course, there are many best practices. There are so many frameworks that we've studied in the book as well, from the McKinsey frameworks to the Edgar Prosci frameworks, to the 7S's and the 4Ds. And of course, none of these are the ultimate answer. But there are some overlapping points. And what we've noticed is that approaches that prioritize people actively seek to de-bias processes instead of individuals and set organizations up for lasting, positive, and sustained change. These are the types of strategies and approaches that hit the spot, that get the results that we want. And of course, that's easier said than done. How do you create these strategies? What are the elements and building blocks? That's what we're going to look at next. The book that we've written the core of it consists out of these evidence-based interventions, 18 of them. And trust me, this has been quite some work to get these together. We've come to so many academic papers, scientific articles, case studies, interviewed over 40 professionals to just see what are they doing? What are the people that are notoriously good at this? What are their secrets, both from academics, practitioners, you name it. And we've ended on these 18 evidence-based interventions. Of course, they're not exhaustive. There's way more, but you have to start somewhere when writing a book. And today we're going to look at the interventions that we found to be most productive when you're working with planning and mitigating behavioral risks in organizational change. This is where the pre-mortem, reference class forecasting, and the whole systems in the room fit into this picture. So I trust the slides are working. The slides are moving. You're actually seeing images here. Otherwise, my team can inform me over chat or app if I need to change something here in the settings. Again, this is the first time we're facilitating this on MS Teams, so we are adapting to these new technical circumstances. But I hope that you're sticking with me. So that being said, let's dive into these interventions. There is this story that always pops into my mind and into the minds of my teammates as well when we talk about planning and risk. And that's the story of Brandenburg Airport. You're probably familiar with this story since it's quite close to us. The case of Brandenburg Airport is a stellar example of human error and risk and planning and how challenges could be turned into opportunities for improvement, to put it lightly. It was conceived in the early 90s that they were going to build this new airport, Brandenburg Airport. And they got to work. And I'm not going to waste too much time on the details of this story, but they were scheduled to open only in 2010. So this is almost 20 years later, because of several big errors in planning, the contractors that went bankrupt. There was even some speech of bribery within the stakeholders involved. I don't know if this is true, but what is true is that when they were opening this airport, they were trying to open it. The inspectors found around 120,000 individual errors within the airport systems, processes, structures, whatever. And they also noticed that about 170,000 kilometers of cable was wired in such a way that it's actually dangerous for people to be at the airport and for the airplanes to operate there. So of course, in 2010, it was shut down. The opening was shut down. The actual opening only occurred 10 years later, so we're now 30 years ahead of this conception. And believe me, this is a long time, even for building an airport. And they opened just in time for the COVID pandemic, which was not good for revenue in 2020. And the final analysis showed that they had a delay of decades and an estimated cost overrun of approximately 5 billion euros. So this is crazy. And of course, you cannot attribute everything to human error. But in this specific case, human error, biases, and behavior play a very big role. And we're going to use the interventions to see what's wrong here and how we can do it better in the future. And of course, I'm not just talking about building airports here. This is about every project, every decision can benefit from these types of interventions. The first one is called the pre-mortem. One of my personal favorites, invented by Gary Klein, and first published in 2007, but before that, there was already a lot of academic stuff going on. A pre-mortem is about identifying and mitigating unseen risks, and in my opinion, every manager should be able to do this. You're probably familiar with a post-mortem, which is what they do in hospitals when they operate on a deceased patient to see, what went wrong, what can we do better in the future, which is a great practice, but it doesn't really help the patient. That is a bit problematic. The patient, that's why it's called post-mortem. Pre-mortem works in a different way. In a pre-mortem, you're trying to bridge these biases that we talked about, the planning fallacy, the black swan effect, where we don't factor in risks, and also the authority bias. We want to create dialogue with pre-mortem. And the way in which it works is by turning the post-mortem upside down. So what we're doing is we are envisioning a future scenario, in the case of Brandenburg Airport, this is, maybe 10 years ahead, where the project went horribly wrong. And we're trying to, as a team, as a decision-making team, we're trying to figure out what this looks like. We're telling stories about the worst case scenario. And then we work backwards from that. So we're using retrospective thinking instead of thinking towards an end goal. And in psychology, this retrospective thinking has proven very valuable. It puts us on edge. It makes us very much more logical and analytical, and it complements our own intuition by just raising our attention and effort a bit more. Now, what pre-mortems have shown over the years, because they were first published in 2007, many managers adopted these pre-mortems, and what we found is that it really helps mitigate potential planning errors, not just in budgeting, but also in timelines, also in resource allocation, in the allocation of stakeholders. And by imagining this worst case scenario and working backwards, many organizations have found that they can easily identify these unseen risks, things that would have gone unnoticed, because now you're not doing what you're used to, which is thinking forwards, you're thinking backwards, you're putting yourself on edge. And you probably notice in your own thinking as well, right? We're very good at saying, oh, I knew this all along. I knew all along this would happen. Now that we're looking at it from retrospect, it's really easy to see why this has gone wrong. You use that same type of thinking with a pre-mortem, but you flip it upside down. You're doing it before things went wrong. And the last really good a good example of pre-mortem in action is that it fosters dialogue. It fosters an open culture where everyone is pitching in because it hasn't happened yet. You're trying to create this story together and work backwards. And it's really good at creating ownership as well. So really practical. How can you apply a pre-mortem? And of course, when you do this the first time, it's good to take half a day, or maybe at least like a long meeting, 90 minutes. But when you get better at this, you can do this really quickly. You can do a pre-mortem in 5 minutes as well, because the logic behind it isn't that hard. If you have your decision-making team, and if you can also do this on your own, by the way, but usually you would do this in a team. You divide it in 2 groups. You invite one group to paint that worst case scenario. And then what's also good is to invite the other group, the other half, to paint the best case scenario. And you really challenge them to flesh this out. What does this look like in the future? How can we make sure that this worst case and best case scenario are really clear? And then you challenge them in a structured way to work backwards and identify what are the red flags? What are the things that we are going to see along the way in case of Brandenburg Airport? Like, will there be a contractor that goes bankrupt? Will there be stakeholders that are very short? Do we have to hire a lot more people? Will we miss deadlines? Will we miss go lives? It's a lot easier to do this when you work backwards. And what you end up with is this, we almost call it like a reverse roadmap with all these critical failure factors and critical success factors that you can now proactively keep track of. You can assign responsibilities. You can make sure that you build on this. And basically, that is the logic of a pre-mortem. Instead of working forwards, you work backwards. And it's simple, but it's been proven very, very effective in many contexts. So I'd say, try it. Here are some questions that you can use. And of course, just send me an email. We can send you these questions and templates. Of course, we can help you along the way, structure these, facilitate these. What are we nervous about? What could make us miss a deadline? What are blind spots in past projects? What are our biggest risk areas? You have a lot of conversation starters that can make a pre-mortem very, very effective. And once you do this a couple of times, you'll notice that it's quite uncomfortable, but it can also be quite fun. And it is very, very effective for better planning and mitigating behavioral risks. Good. If you want to read more on the pre-mortem, we posted an article with Forbes as well, where we outline a detailed 10-step plan. You should be able to find it if you just Neurofied Forbes pre-mortem. You can get a bit more deeper into this subject matter. Great. Now, I know I'm shooting a lot of information your way, and I'll go through these 2 interventions, and then we'll go through some questions if we have time. But I'd rather that you master these behavioral interventions in this webinar. So the second one, reference class forecasting. And this is a bit of a complex one, but we'll go through it in a way that's understandable for everyone. Reference class forecasting is a technique for accurate budgeting. Again, it's a behavioral technique. Psychologists came up with this. It's based on the work by Kahneman and Tversky, the guy that wrote Thinking Fast and Slow, and first published a bit later by several behavioral scientists, and it's been proven very effective. And I'll tell you a bit more about that later. What reference class forecasting is a technique to predict budgets and predict planning decisions in a more accurate way. Brandenburg Airport is just one of these examples, but there are many thousands of examples of project overruns, cost overruns, missed deadlines, even with the top level fiscal analysts and logistical thinkers and the top people in risk. Nobody can catch everything. And there are these biases that we discussed: planning fallacy, over-optimism, anchoring. We won't go into too much detail on biases. We'd like to talk more about solutions today. But together they create overly optimistic forecasts, to put it lightly, when we make budgeting decisions. And in psychology, we describe this as the inside view. When we are in a project, in a certain decision, we're working on it with a team, we're very, very focused on that particular project. And we often forget past projects, historical data, how other companies are doing it in other sectors. And we're very stuck inside our own inside view. And again, this is an unconscious process, so you're not aware when this is happening, but it is influencing your decisions. This inside view has been researched very thoroughly by Kahneman and his colleagues, and it's a big problem, not just in planning and risk, but particularly in planning and risk. Let's see what we can do about this. So these scientists created this technique called reference class forecasting, and I'll walk you through the details in just a bit, to counter this inside view and adopt an outside view. How can we make sure that decision makers don't just focus on what's in front of them in this particular project, but also historical data, other industries, other sectors? How are they doing it? How can we make a reference class out of other projects, other data, to make sure that we can make more accurate predictions? And unfortunately, this is just not something that most human brains do by default. That is why these techniques are concocted and why they're such valuable tools. So to summarize that, we have an inside view when it comes down to the projects that we're working on. This causes us to discount data that's very useful, other projects, other industries, other sectors. Reference class forecasting helps us create an outside view. And that makes us able to make more accurate planning decisions. Now, let's see what reference class forecasting is all about. Before that, fun fact, before I dive into the protocol, the UK government, they have mandated reference class forecasting for projects that are budgeted for over £40 million. And with that, they have reduced cost overruns in these projects from 38% to 5%. And this is crazy when you talk about efficacy rates of behavioral intervention. So go UK government, very good. The Dutch have followed them. They're working on this as well. This is how serious people are taking these types of interventions. Good. Let's see how we can, you don't have to be a government to apply reference class forecasting. Let's see how we can do it and make it effective for our own use. So imagine you're starting a new project, you're encountering a change, you know that we need a budget for it, but you're unsure what exactly it is. You're unsure how to make the estimate. First, you want to choose your reference clause. So you want to see if you can access data of past projects. So let's back to the Brandenburg Airport example, right? These decision makers, it would have been very wise if they were to collect as much data as they could on similar airport construction projects. You know, maybe they did some in Saudi Arabia, maybe they did some in the Netherlands or in the UK or in the US, wherever. And you want to look for projects that are quite similar, yet unique to your own. So total cost, schedule adherence, other relevant factors. You want to structure this reference class of similar projects and have a very objective view on it. You know, what are the averages that we're seeing here? What are the means? What are the deviations that we see? What are the patterns that we can analyze? And based on that, so you have your own project, you collected, let's say you collected data of 10 other projects from competitors, other industries, and maybe past projects that you did that look like this project. And you use that as an anchor, as a reference point to make, you know, a good estimate about what this particular project is going to cost. And again, this might sound very logical and straightforward. You might be already doing this, but what we see when we analyze decision makers is that they're not doing this enough, creating a reference class, creating an outside view. And now in the UK government, they take this very seriously. They work with huge data sets. They work with a lot of statistical inferences as well. They create what are called correlation coefficients to make this very, very precise. And you can do this as well. I mean, every data scientist or analyst is capable of doing this. So if you have access to them, ask them about this. They can help you. But if you don't, just use this simple protocol. You know, collect a reference class, find projects that are similar, study them, see what they're all about, and make an estimate, not just based on your own inside view, but also of those other projects. It can be that simple, but it can have a huge effect on cost overruns and planning fallacies in your own decision making. So I would say if you take this and start experimenting, if you have a small reference class of 5 to 10 similar projects or similar decisions that you're going to make, that's already good. You don't have to work with thousands of similar reference classes, but you know, you can if you want to. And see how this observes cost overrun. See if you can make it measurable. See if you can make a business case around reference class forecasting. And again, of course, you can start small and scale up later. Okay, and I'm aware this reference cost forecasting, it's a very analytical technique, so it might be a bit hard to get your head around at first, but there's plenty of reading that you can do to get even deeper into this. And of course, you know, we would always like to have that conversation with you as well. And then we move to the third behavioral intervention. And again, I noticed that I'm going through this at a rapid pace, but we really want to get these insights out there before the book hits the market to you know, the professionals that are actually going to use this stuff. And we're really curious about some early feedback as well. And probably the scientists that have worked on these interventions are too. So here, we're looking at the intervention that is characterized as whole systems in a room. It's a bit of a difficult name, you know, that academics often come up with these lovely names, but I'll tell you all about it and how it can be useful. It can be a true catalyst for managing strategic risk in change and for making sure that you can get broad perspective of all stakeholders involved and make decisions based on their input and not just on your own views. So this whole systems in a room has been derived from Marvin Weisbord's work. He's a great organizational development specialist. He made tons of frameworks, and this is the thing that stuck with us most. It is a tool, an intervention that can really help you foster an inclusive decision-making environment in change initiatives. You know, we always talk about organizational change, but it goes even broader than that. It is a tool that can really help kickstart open debates, psychological safety, crucial and courageous conversations, and make sure that there is a culture of speaking up within your company. This is something that you know, I don't have to tell you that if you're working in risk, but this is something that is one of the most important elements when it comes down to mitigating risk and especially behavioral risk, and also finding an acceptable degree of risk. More about that later. So what makes whole systems in a room different? It kind of looks like the pre-mortem, but it's a lot broader. The pre-mortem is focused on, you know, a specific team trying to achieve a specific project or decision. This is a lot broader. You want to have a landscape of stakeholders that is as broad as possible. Everyone that works in this system, the change seen as a system, needs to be drawn into this discussion, needs to be talking about the risks and opportunities that can be achieved, and needs to make sure that their voices are heard and that collective decision making and collective wisdom are factored into planning. And this all sounds very theoretical, but I promise you I'll get to the practicalities right away. What we've seen in practice, and I know that there are some people in the webinar right now that are probably aware of this or have worked on this with us or with their clients, is that if you apply these systems in a room, for example, in a workshop format, where you invite all the stakeholders that are working on a change. This is your system, right? The stakeholders that are working on a change with you, that are impacted by the change, and you have these dialogues. You have these dialogues about the risks that they might perceive, the risks that they might accept or might reject, the opportunities that might be seized. This is what ING did, the big financial institution here in the Netherlands. I think they're still doing this. They have these dynamic system in the room workshops to make sure that they foster cross-functional and cross-departmental collaboration and real ownership when it comes to continuous change, transformation, transitioning. They really harness the power of systems in a room, get the system in a room, get everyone in a room together and talking about something. Basically, that's what it boils down to. And they see that it really helps in terms of decision-making, in terms of ownership, in terms of collaboration. So let's see how we can dive into this. Systems in the room, by the way, it's also a really good tool at overcoming cognitive biases and barriers to change, because it breaks open the conversations. It brings the stakeholders together in a room. Everyone that works in this organizational system comes together and discusses. I keep repeating this because it's the key point. This is great to mitigate things like confirmation bias, groupthink, anchoring bias, authority bias. And again, if you don't know any of these names or you're not familiar with all these biases, it's no problem. It basically means that it's great for us to overcome errors in our thinking. And of course, as I said, the culture of openness and experimentation that it fosters is something that can never be discounted when you use this whole systems in the room approach. So if you want to implement this, and again, you can make this as big and as small scale as you want, but it basically boils down to these elements. And there's not a real tight mandate to this or mandatory steps that you have to follow. It's not really about mandating content. It's about facilitating structure. So you want to assemble your system. And as I said before, your system is all the stakeholders that are impacted by the change, they are working on the systems, they're working on the processes, they're working on the policies, they're working on the front line. You want to get as many of them in a room to talk about the change that you're facing. That's why it's got systems in room again. And you want to make sure that you foster a climate where they can voice their opinion, where they're not afraid to speak up, and where their input is also translated into actual decisions. Their input, their collective wisdom is being brought into the decision-making process. So what you want to be talking about during such a system in a room exercise is, now we're talking about planning a risk. So discuss those risks, discuss different risks for different stakeholders and departments, different people that have a stake in this change, that are impacted by this change. Find out what degree of risk is acceptable to them and what degree of risk will get in the way of their ways of working, processes. Align these factors. This is what systems in a room is all about. And with this, of course, you get a lot of input, you get a lot of yield out of this. This is how you can harness collective intelligence as well. You tap into all these inputs from different stakeholders, different departments, different teams that are collectively working on this system. And you make sure that you use that in the best way possible to create a plan for change, a change strategy, a change plan that is incorporating this at the front, at the start of the change. You don't want to be doing systems in the room workshops way at the end of a transition. You want to get this done as quick as possible, because it will give you a realistic view of what is going to happen. It's going to give you a realistic view of how people are actually going to act in the face of change, what they expect from you, what they need, and how they can weigh in to create ownership and collaboration. So again, if you heard about this for the first time, systems in the room, it might be a lot of information, but you should get the key points, and you should see how it's useful for people and organizations to plan for change, to calibrate risk, and to be able to mitigate unnecessary behavioral risks along the way as well. So in conclusion, it can really give you a framework, systems in a room. It can give you a basis for ownership and collaboration and drawing in perspectives, and also actually doing something with that, following up on stakeholder feedback and making sure it's factored into a change plan or strategy at the start. It's pretty crucial, and I would not recommend any professional or organization to miss out on this when they're embarking on a big transition or an entire business transformation. So yeah, I would say definitely start experimenting with taking the system in a room. Okay, well, this has been quite an interesting lunch webinar, and we've discussed a lot of insights, 3 of these evidence-based interventions. And of course, I told you about the book that we're working on that includes 18 of these evidence-based interventions. The book goes into all the details that you'll need to really do this step by step. It gauges all the nuances, all the contextual elements. So there's always more to learn about these interventions. But today, I hope that we have given you at least the core knowledge that you need to know about, why we should do this in the first place. Why are these evidence-based behavioral interventions important when it comes down to countering change, when it comes down to working under uncertain conditions, when it comes down to transforming your organization, and also some basic blueprints to get started with this, to experiment, do a pre-mortem. And if you're wondering, where do I find time to do all this? We're already so busy, calendars are full. Start small with this stuff. There are existing meetings where you can do a pre-mortem, where you take half an hour and you pilot a pre-mortem. Plan at your next quarterly meeting to do a small systems in a room workshop. Talk to your risk analyst and talk to the people in charge of budgeting decisions, and talk to them about reference class forecasting. Can we put together a reference class for a next decision? And you don't have to completely overhaul your existing organizational structures and the way that you work and collaborate, but you can start making small incremental changes based on these interventions that can really help you get there, that can help you take those steps. Okay. So enough information from me. We'll move to the Q&A. I'll stop the recording as well. I hope that the mics will work, but otherwise we can use the chat as well. And of course, if you want to drop off, feel free to do so if you want to grab lunch still. I would just let you go then before we move to the Q&A with some resources if you want to learn more. We have a whole YouTube channel dedicated to these interventions and strategies. We have a blog with over 100 articles that discuss behavioral topics. And we have databases that you can find on our website that dive deeper into the biases. If you're interested in this, there's always more to find when it comes down to brain and behavior. And then I will turn to the chat and start answering some of your questions.